Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next URI College of the Environment and Life Sciences Learn at Home webinar. This is going to be a good one. Thanks for joining us or watching. If you've clicked this link in YouTube, we're really happy to bring this information to you. Today, we're going to talk about preserving the bounty and frequently asked questions around putting up food that you've grown or bought from a local farm. And Sejal Lanterman and Nicole Richard, my great friends and colleagues, are going to share that info with us. Next slide. So many of you, if you've joined us before, have heard me or a colleague say this, but Sejal, Nicole, and I all work for Cooperative Extension at the University of Rhode Island, and we're very proud of that because Cooperative Extension is actually the part of the university that interfaces outward with the public, and we pride ourselves on bringing science-based information out to folks to help them solve problems and enhance their lives. And so today, our webinar falls within our food systems and agriculture focus area, but many could argue it also falls into healthy lifestyles and maybe all of them. Next slide. So we've been around for 100 years, and all that we do in extension has been rooted in agriculture. But as time goes on and folks are dealing with other issues around energy and water and land and health and wellness, we've kind of expanded our programming to address all of those issues. And one thing that is we've all committed to talking about is that it's really important that we serve all the people of Rhode Island, not just the folks who can get to us. And so this webinar series has been a really great way for us to extend and pivot further, into communities where folks can't get down to the university. And so because we are committed to social justice and making everyone's lives better, if you all could please spread the word about extension in Rhode Island, that we have free resources for folks around all different kinds of issues. And today we will focus on enhancing people's food security. And hopefully what Sejal and Nicole have to say will inspire you all to grow more food so you have more food to put up and feed your families well into the winter time. So next slide. I'm just going to talk about a couple housekeeping items, and then I will turn it over to Sejal and Nicole. We will do questions and answers at the end of their presentation, which we'll do after there's two final slides. So a few housekeeping things. There is a Q&A box you can enter questions in, and we will try our best to get to all of them at the end. Also, when the webinar is over, for those of you who are here live, there's almost 100 of you, we will automatically send you a survey, and we use those survey responses to gauge how well our educational efforts are helping you to do the right thing better, if you will. So we really appreciate you taking the time. It'll take you a minute or two to fill that survey out, which will come into your email. Check your spam or forum folder for that. And lastly, we get this question all the time, and we do have a Cooperative Extension YouTube channel that is available through a search engine, or you can go to YouTube and type in URI Cooperative Extension. All of the Learn at Home webinars that we've offered since April of 2020 are posted there. So there's a treasure trove of information, and they're all closed captions to make sure that everybody can understand what's going on. And so with that, I would just say if anyone's having audio problems, the best way to deal with that is to make sure the volume on your device is turned up. And without further ado, I'm not sure who's going to speak first, but next slide. And I'm going to introduce Nicole and Sejal, who are our food preservation mavens in extension and great colleagues. And you're all in for a treat. I'll see you in about 40 minutes.
Great, thanks. So I think we're both unmuted. Nicole, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can.
Yes. So, oh wow, that is a very professional photo we have here. Introduce ourselves. So yes, Nicole and I are secretly witches when we are not teaching food preservation. No, Nicole and I, our relationship goes really back professionally and as friends. This is her and I at an annual food safety conference that we go to usually every year. Probably this year it will be virtual, but we've known each other for a really long time. This is us doing I think it was a green tea mask. Is that what that was?
Yeah, you brought it.
Yeah. So Nicole and I have been co-teaching when we're not co-teaching with our awesome food preservation series. I work really closely with farmers with our produce safety rule and the Rhode Island GAP program. So those are both programs that are geared for farmers that either for regulatory purposes or for voluntary purposes need to or want to comply with best practices when it comes to food safety. But Nicole and I really enjoy co-teaching together with food preservation. We've done that typically at URI in the kitchens, in the labs, as a sort of a hands-on workshop. And it's been really great. Unfortunately, we've had to hit pause on that. We do hope to go back to that. So I really want to plug that in because for some people, it can be kind of scary, using a pressure cooker for the first time. We've all heard those stories of, that have been passed down of, the great grandma making spaghetti and it explodes in the house. Well, we can give you the tools to not be scared of that pressure cooker. I think we've also heard that improperly home cooked canned foods. We've heard of botulism and, we've heard of that happening with improperly canned foods. So we don't want to scare anybody, but what we do want to do is give you the educational tools to understand how to prevent those things, because it's very, very easy. A lot of the times when home canning or home preservation goes wrong, it's when we're not following the rules. So that's sort of our goal here. Nicole, I'll let you talk for a second, a little bit about what you do when we're not teaching food preservation.
Yes, hi, I'm Nicole Richard. I primarily work more with processors. So I'm the lead trainer for preventive controls for human food, which helps processors comply with regulatory requirements for processing. I chair the Food Safety Task Force, which primarily is targeting the retail food service industry. So I work with that industry as well. And then this food preservation hands-on series that we do, which is a lot of fun. And then in my downtime, I sort of play around in the lab and have some fun in there.
Yeah, that's right. And Nicole really has a lot of the food science background, which is really important with all this because she's going to help us prevent botulism. And I tend to be growing a little bit more and canning these things. And we really kind of come together and round each other out in that sense. And a lot of times we'll even finish each other's sentences. So that's what we plan to do here as we go through the slides. We're going to kind of go back and forth and we're going to explore some of the questions that we have gotten quite often every time we teach in person. The same questions tend to crop up when it comes to canning, when it comes to dehydrating or freezing. So we're going to kind of explore those, but we also want you to know that Nicole and I are also on the back end trying to figure out how we can do like a live how to can type of workshop. So stay connected to us. We'll give you some contact information at the end. Sign up for Cooperative Extension emails, follow us on social media, all that. And we hope to be able to offer more in this world of canning and preservation. So I think I just got a quick little disclaimer here that I'm just going to read. So trade and brand names are used only for information and educational purposes. URI Cooperative Extension does not guarantee nor warrant published standards on any product mentioned. Neither does the use of trade or brand name imply approval of any product to the exclusion of others, which may also be suitable. So, you might see some pictures of dehydrators, or we might a type of canning jar, but just know that there are so many different options out there. If you're in the market for, a new pressure canner, your best bet is to, do reviews and go to reputable sites. So we'll try to talk very broadly about some of the products and things, but there's not just any one type. So that's just a quick little disclaimer. So I'm just going to talk for a minute or so, and then I'll turn it over to you, Nicole. So a few rules of thumb that really we can think about with preserving in any sort of way. So if you're canning or freezing, so this golden rule of garbage in, garbage out. So if you've got tomatoes that, are looking like those on the screen, those are really should be going into your compost pile. Those should not be going into our body. Those should not be getting canned or frozen. So garbage in, garbage out. You really want to start with fresh, high quality produce. And that's a good golden rule of thumb, not to be confused with ugly tomatoes. That is not an ugly tomato. I think ugly tomatoes are usually what we think of when we think of heirloom tomatoes. And I think sometimes they get a bad reputation, but that does not mean that they are delicious. Heirloom tomatoes are the best, and they don't always have that uniform shape. But what we want to look for when we're talking about garbage or spoiled produce is, some of the mold that we're seeing that's growing on there, any bruises or deep blemishes. When we think about our body, we think about the skin on our body, that's our first line of defense for, if we, to fight against infection. So when we have a cut or an open sore, that's a lot of times how we get infected. And that's the same when we're talking about tomatoes. If there's a open sore, that is just perfect entryway for pathogens, think Salmonella and E. coli, to sort of enter in, and that's where we can run into trouble. So garbage in, garbage out. Whether you're freezing, canning, dehydrating, storing, harvesting, always want to start with clean hands. So good old-fashioned soap and water. You want to have a clean workspace, which is usually the kitchen in your world, and of course, cleaning off your produce before you preserve anything. And then also you want to think about, if you're growing your own food, best practices. So what can you do in the garden to prevent anything from going wrong, if you will, later on? So like I just mentioned, Salmonella and E. coli typically comes from animals. It can come in the water if we're adding manure. So getting to know the risks with gardening and making sure whether or not that makes sense to do. So let me explain that a little bit further. So we have this really great resource. This is going to get emailed to you guys automatically. So we have this garden to table booklet that really kind of just talks about what are those best practices when it comes to preparing the garden. So thinking about where you're locating it, the type of compost that you're using. We really advocate for not using manure directly in the garden, but if you are, maybe the better bet would be to properly compost it. So information in regards to that. We'll also explore maintaining the garden in this booklet, protecting it from wild and domestic animals. That's in your best interest. It's not so much when animals visit the garden, it's what they leave behind. So it doesn't matter what type of animal they are, a carnivore, an herbivore, if they leave some sort of feces or manure behind, there's likely going to be pathogenic material in there. So water sources, do you have a well? Are you on town water? If you're on town water, you really don't have to think about it gets tested for you, but how often are you testing your well, especially if you're drinking it? So harvesting your garden produce, so just thinking about good personal hygiene, really common sense type stuff. There's information in this packet about storing garden produce. We always get a lot of questions about to wash or to not wash. So an example of that would be something like berries. Typically, berries shouldn't get washed until you're about to eat them, because typically they'll spoil a little bit quicker if we wash them. And then there's also lots of questions that we explore, like to refrigerate or not refrigerate. Some stuff we know the taste doesn't work out so well, something like tomatoes, but you want to think about making sure where you're storing your tomatoes on your countertop is nice and clean. And if you've got a cat that jumps on the counter, kind of want to connect those dots as well. And then lastly, preparing and serving fresh garden produce. So just give some great tips that a lot of people do know on cross-contamination, but really connects the dots on some other issues, and just some general tips on preserving. And there's a really awesome storage chart. So I definitely urge you guys to take a quick look at that and give yourself a crash course in food safety and growing food. All right, so Nicole, first question goes to you.
Okay. So water bath and pressure canning, we're going to talk about that a little bit first. So here's our question. I'd like to try a recipe that's been passed down in my family, or one that I've seen on the internet. Is that safe? The answer is no. Recipes should be tested. Recipes must be scientifically tested to ensure that the cold spot in the jar reaches the correct temperature, and that product is held for a long enough time to kill any microorganisms in it that can cause illness. So these recipes are tested for the time that they're cooked, the temperature, and then the product volume. So this testing isn't something that we do at home. It's something that's done elsewhere. And so what we recommend is using the resource, the Ball Blue Book, or the USDA and other cooperative extension websites that have, they usually have the scientifically tested safe recipes that you can use. And when you're following these recipes, you must follow the recipe directions, use the recommended jar size, and follow the processing time in the canner. So it's important to follow the directions.
Yeah, that's right. And what's also great about that is it's so easy to find some of these recipes from other cooperative extension agencies. So if you're not ready to jump in and grab a book, you can find a lot of approved recipes online. And I'll also say, Nicole mentioned the Ball Blue Book, which I have right here. We give that out during our hands-on series, and it also covers dehydrating and freezing. It's a really great introductory book to a little bit of all the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, and they have Ball has a complete book as well, which has more information on dehydrating. And the University of Georgia has a good book as well.
I think I have that one right here too.
Yeah, so preserving. So they have, those are great resources, and the books aren't that expensive, but you can access some of it online. Okay, so next.
Okay, so approved recipes. Got it. All right, next question.
Okay, so why do you use a pressure canner for some foods and not for others? This all comes down to the pH of the recipe. If the recipe is acidic, it can be safely canned in a water bath canner. If the recipe is not acidic, meaning that it has a higher pH, that typically that recipe is uses a pressure canner. So the reason for this is that there's a pathogen, Clostridium botulinum, that the vegetative cells of this pathogen are killed in the water bath canner. But this pathogen can form spores, and these spores aren't killed in the water bath canning temperature. So you need the pressure canning temperature, that higher temperature that's reached under pressure in order to kill the spores. And so that's the main difference between the two canning methods. Let's see, I have notes here. I just want to make sure I said all of the key things. So in a pressure canner, you can reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit, which kills the spores. The water bath canner only reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of boiling water. And if you don't kill the spores, they'll germinate in the food and produce toxin, and that toxin will make you sick. And it can be deadly. It's a neurotoxin. It affects your nervous system. And it's not something that we hear about often because it's not something that happens a lot, but it does happen. When it does happen, it's very severe. So that's why it's so important that you follow the recipe. You know, if it's telling you to use water bath canner, you can use a water bath canner. If it's telling you to use a pressure canner, you need to use a pressure canner. You can't use a water bath canner in lieu of a pressure canner. And the other thing I'd like to say about a pressure canner is it's not the same as a pressure cooker. They are different. The pressure cooker is smaller. It doesn't, because of the way it's designed a little differently. So it doesn't heat up it doesn't heat up as well, or the heating up time and the processing time isn't the same. You know, you heat it up, you put it on the stove for 20 minutes, but it's actually not operating the same as the canner. So it's made differently. So they're not interchangeable. And so Clostridium botulinum is a pathogen that really likes this oxygen-free environment. It likes room temperature, and it likes high moisture. So if you think about your canned food, it's the perfect environment for Clostridium. So it's most commonly associated with improperly home canned vegetables. And so it's just really important that you follow the right recipe, the right procedure according to the recipe, and use the pressure canner when it's called for. But when you have botulism outbreaks from improperly home canned vegetables, I'm not talking about someone made a slight deviation from the recipe and, you know, maybe didn't measure as much salt or something like that. I'm talking like they made up their own recipes, they used a water bath canner instead of a pressure canner, or you know, they sped up the time that it was supposed to process. So when you're done pressure canning, there's a long time for the pressure to be released and from that unit before you can safely open it. And that time is still counted towards the processing time. So that's why it's important not to speed up the processing time as well. And so when people speed up the processing time, it's resulted in the spores forming toxin. So it's large deviations. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not talking about little things. You don't have to be afraid to use a pressure canner, but being aware of the importance of using the pressure canner when it's called for in a recipe for safety reasons. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just say, and the great thing about using an approved recipe is it just spells it right out for you. It'll tell you, use a pressure canner or use a water bath canner. And you don't have to think about pH, and you don't have to think about, all of those things, because it will tell you right there. So usually the instructions are really, really great and easy to follow. Are you ready for the next slide?
Yes. And that one's you.
Let's see here. Yeah. Okay. So this next slide that we get a long time is how long will properly canned food keep? So the quick answer to that is at least for 1 year. And the thing about that, you want to think about where you're storing it. So it's one thing to keep just a couple of jars after you've properly canned them in your, your pantry or kind of out and about. But for long-term storage, you really want to think about keeping it in a dark, cool place out of direct sunlight. That's going to help retain some of the nutrients and just keep the quality intact. Something that is properly canned probably can last longer, but for quality purposes, usually we do say a year if you're storing them properly. You'll notice in this picture that you can see a lot of the rings that are on those jars. And Nicole and I were talking about how we always see these stock images with the rings still on there. But actually you want to store those jars with the rings off. So I have one right here that I did that I canned yesterday, some squash and zucchini. And you can see you take the ring off, and once it's properly sealed, there's nothing that this ring is doing, except for in the process, it holds that lid on top, and it allows for that suction, that seal to happen. And then you can store it without the ring, with the ring on. What happens if we store with the ring on, you'll notice that rust can sometimes appear. Those rings can be used from every single year, and your jars can be used every single year, but the lids can actually only be used once. So I just want to make sure that we're all getting that message. But one of the ways that I can tell if it's been used or not is I'll usually label it, so it'll have some sort of marking on the top of the jar. But the lids you can just purchase in boxes every year. So you can keep your rings as long as they're not rusty and they look good. And you just want to inspect your jars before using them and make sure that there's not any cracks. And, as much as we love some of those antique ones that we're finding at flea markets, you really want to make sure you're using ones that are designed for home canning and are not sort of older, because those ones we can't use anymore. They're not safe for proper canning. Nicole, did I cover all the topics in that one? Anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, the only other thing is the jars that you're talking about are the ones with the hinge on it and the lid that the metal thing goes over the other metal thing and it hinges it down. I can't think of what they're called, but those are the jars that are not approved for home canning. And the reason is that no one's tested them. So you don't have a way to know if you actually have that tight seal. So that's why they're not recommended for home canning.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yep, that's right. And one other thing is these jars, actually, not all of them, but most of them work really well for freezing. So when you purchase a new box of jars, you can look right on the box and it will let you know, it'll check off if they're freezer safe. I have learned the hard way that the larger quart ones are not. And I've had them explode and bust in my freezer and glass shards, you could just imagine. But the smaller ones and even the pint and the half pint, really great for freezing. I'm going to talk sort of at the end there of some easy, freezer type situations. If you don't have a big bounty all at once, you can always freeze some of these things. All right. So the next slide, let's wake my computer back up here. Yep. Here we go. This is you, Nicole.
Okay. What's the proper way to thaw frozen food? And this is a great question that we get. And there are considerations for safety. There's 3 ways to thaw food safely. You can thaw it in the refrigerator, which is the best because you're keeping it at a cold temperature while you're thawing it. You can also thaw in cold water or in the microwave. When you thaw in cold water or in the microwave, you want to cook the food thoroughly after. You don't want to stick it in the fridge. Whereas if you thaw in the refrigerator and you decide, I really you thaw it and you're not holding it for an extended period of time, you can safely refreeze it because it's been at that cold temperature. But you don't, when it's thawed in the microwave or in cold water, it's not that same cold temperature. So you want to cook it after you thaw it. And then you can freeze that cooked food if you want to freeze it after. If you have vacuum sealed bags, one thing that you really want to do is open those bags up. And the same thing with the cans is that it's an oxygen-free environment that can support the growth of Clostridium botulinum. So if it happens to be in there and you're thawing a vacuum sealed bag on the counter, you could have a problem. So you really want to cut a hole into that bag and make sure that it's thawed in, and ideally in the refrigerator. But we get meat that's vacuum sealed, and I cut a hole in it and I'll stick it in cold water and thaw it regularly. That's because I don't plan ahead well enough. So I'm usually thawing last minute, and I try not to do the microwave because it makes it a little chewier sometimes. But you want to make sure you cut that bag open. It's very important, and that you thoroughly cook it after. Okay. Okay, and here's another question. Does freezing destroy harmful bacteria and parasites? And this is a great question because cold temperatures slow the growth of most bacteria. There's a few that can still grow at refrigerated temperatures, but most bacteria are not going to have slow growth at refrigerated temperatures. When you freeze it, you will stop the growth of bacteria, but you don't kill the bacteria. You may harm a few of the bacterial cells, but you're not really killing them off. It's not a method to use for killing off. Sub-zero frozen temperatures held for a certain period of time will kill parasites. Some seafood and meat products are associated with parasites. They're a natural occurrence. It's not a contamination issue, but the parasites can be a health concern. Home freezers don't reach a cold enough temperature to use the home freezer as a method for killing parasites. Your best line of defense is to thoroughly cook the food, because that will kill any parasites. So it's really important that you properly cook your food. Okay. And then lastly, how long can things last in the freezer, and what if my power goes out? So frozen foods stored continuously at 0 Fahrenheit or below can be kept indefinitely. There are different guidelines for how long different products can maintain in the freezer, and that's really about quality. As long as that food has been frozen, it's safe, but the quality will decline over time. You might have freezer burn, which is a loss of moisture, and a dryness that occurs from that moisture loss. So quality, as long as it's frozen, it's safe over a year. If the power goes out, it's important to keep your refrigerator and freezer doors closed. An unopened refrigerator will keep food safe for about 4 hours. You want to discard any food that's been at room temperature for 2 hours or more. And thawed food can be eaten if it's refrigerated cold. You want to cook any perishable food when possible. Keep a supply of water and a bottled water on hand. And if the freezer reads 40 Fahrenheit or below, the food is safe to refreeze. So it's really important to have thermometers in your refrigerator or freezer if you have those available. They help you to make decisions. But if you're in doubt of the safety of your food product, throw it out. And there are resources that will share that. There's a link for a resource by the USDA that outlines a lot of the parameters for when it's safe, when food's not safe if the power goes out. And I think it's a good resource that we will share in case anyone finds value in it. I know we do lose power around here when hurricanes hit or blizzards, and so it's something that happens regularly.
Yeah, we are in that season, so hopefully that won't happen to too many of us, but that's relevant and helpful information. And Nicole, so if something comes out and it still has like crystals on it and it's really cold, like that's okay to refreeze then once your power goes back on. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, because the crystals indicate that it's thawed, but it's still, like the crystals are indicating it's still frozen.
Right, okay. See, okay, here we go. Okay, so I think I'm up. So now we're gonna kind of pivot into dehydrating, which is one of my favorite activities because it's relatively easy and not a lot of food safety concerns. So the question that we get all the time is it safe to air dry or dry things outside using the sun? And unfortunately, the answer to that is really no, for a number of reasons. One, because we really don't have the temperature that they have in other parts of the world. It's very humid here. So we're, it's hard to get a properly dried product. But also there's just a plethora of other food safety concerns with air drying outside, because chances are a lot of these things, tomatoes can take hours, and we're not out there watching the tomatoes like a hawk. So we're not sure what's flying overhead, what could have left something behind, what could be visiting those things, think mice and rodents and other animals. So it's really not best to do it outside, but there are a number of different ways that you can do it inside. A lot of people have heard of food dehydrators, and they are really great. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Usually there's some sort of forced air that comes from the top or from the bottom. A lot of these dehydrators come where you can take the thinking out, because it will tell you on the knob, you put it on this temperature for tomatoes, put it on this temperature for fruits or for herbs, jerky. It even does yogurt and fruit leathers, all these different things. You can see how there's trays. I think when I was doing this one, I was needing a therapeutic moment by lining them all out. That way you don't have to, you can really get them a little bit tighter space, but you can see how one layer, those are sage leaves. So lots of herbs that you can also do all at once. Sometimes you can get a little bit of flavors overlapping, but you can get a lot done in one session. So when we have a lot of herbs, we'll try to harvest them right before they flower, when their flavor is most robust. And we will line those different trays. You plug it in, so it does use energy. So that's something you need to think about, which is why when we do use it, we try to put in as much as possible. But you can also do tomatoes, peppers. Well, a lot of hot pepper flavors are done this way, dried garlic, dried onions. Really, you know when these things are done, tomatoes, for example, when they're no longer sticky or tacky. So the biggest food safety concern with dehydrating foods is mold growth later on. So we really want to make sure we're getting the moisture out, and a dehydrator makes that pretty easy. And it really infuses the room that you're doing. It's like a giant, one of those plugins that omits the smells, except this is using some of these wonderful things that you're growing. So food dehydrators are really popular. Explore all the different things that you can do with that. I just only mentioned a few. At the end, we do have a resource on using these other methods like a microwave. I'll be transparent. I have not used a microwave to dehydrate foods. It can be done. I've seen a lot of people use it for herbs. So we have a handout on that we'll email to you. And also ovens. Ovens sort of can be used and they sort of can't be used. When you think about the food dehydrator, when I was talking about how there's preset numbers on there, for herbs, it's preset to 90 degrees. So most of our ovens cannot get that low. My oven, I think, goes to about 200 degrees. So you'd have to sort of crack that oven door open to get that right temperature. And I have kids running around, so there's some safety issues right there. I'm not really comfortable. And it's summertime and I don't want to heat up my house. But an oven can be used for certain things like kale chips. That's been very popular over the last couple of years. Making kale chips in your oven as low as 200 degrees is possible. So you can use all these different methods for dehydrating, but again, we don't recommend air drying outside. Anything you want to add to that, Nicole? I can look with a head nod. Okay. I think you were going to do this one. Okay.
Okay, I'm muting when you're talking because there's background noise. So, okay. How long does dehydrated food last? Dried food typically keeps for 4 to 12 months. It really depends on the storage conditions. Ideally, you want to minimize the moisture uptake. So you can do things like store your dried fruits in jars. You can use bags. You're going to want to, you want to store it in something and try to minimize the moisture uptake. Store it in a cool, dark area that's dry. And then for best quality although it's not necessary to store these dried foods in the refrigerator or freezer, sometimes you might want to if you have a large volume that you've dried, because it's going to prevent it from taking up moisture. Like I know I've made jerky in the past, and I've stored some of the extra jerky in the freezer. And the reason for this was also, you know, the fat can oxidize over time and change the flavor a little. So I wanted to store it in the freezer so it would just preserve it longer. But you know, you don't have to for everything. So it generally, you know, as long as you don't see mold growth, then you know that you're good. Okay, and then another one, is it safe to infuse oil and store it on the counter? And the answer is no. There's a risk of Clostridium botulinum, like we talked about before, because this oil is an oxygen-free environment, and the spores can be on the herbs or the garlic that's used. And additionally, if you're using fresh produce, it can contain water, which will allow the bacteria to grow. So safe options for infusing oils at home include, you know, you can make it up with your herbs and the oil, and then, you know, maybe put them in ice cube trays and freeze some of them, and then just take them out and thaw them as you need them. You can use properly dried herbs or garlic, so it doesn't have, so they're dried, so they don't have the moisture in them. And I'm not recommending that you just go out and throw things together. There's a resource that we're going to send to you from the University of Maine. They have a really good resource on infusing oils. Hold on, I lost my train of thought because I looked at the chat, and someone just said, is there a way to watch this later? And yes, there is. So when you go to the store and you buy shelf-stable, commercially processed garlic, you know, sitting in oil, how is that allowed? And it's not safe for us to do it at home. And the reason is that commercially processed garlic is acidified, and it's not recommended that we acidify. I'm not recommending that you acidify garlic or foods at home, because you need to know that the pH inside the garlic, you just need to know that the pH is low enough, and it's not something that's, you know, not recommended for home processors. So so another option is to infuse vinegars. So that's why we have the picture there, because that's acidic and you don't have to worry about Clostridium, and you can infuse vinegars and give those out as gifts as well. Okay. Did you have anything to add to that, Sejal?
No, I don't think so. I think that's great. And I love you had mentioned about infusing the oils and freezing them, because I'll do that a lot of the times with fresh herbs as well. We'll use ice cube trays and mince up our herbs, put them into the trays and pour really good extra virgin olive oil into them. And we freeze them and then pop them out and then keep them in the freezer as a safer way to infuse oils for later on in the winter, and a really easy way to put up herbs. But no, I thought that was great. So now we're just we're sort of getting towards the tail end. We will take some of your questions at the end. We wanted to give some bonus tips, because we're always getting this question of removing tomato skins. If you've canned before or made Italian spaghetti sauce or any sort of sauce recipes, a lot of the times they'll call for removing the skins. It's really hard when you go to puree that sauce to not really puree the peels, and you'll end up with the peels in your mouth. So removing the skins, there's a couple of different ways to do that. So I wanted to call those out, because sometimes when we're harvesting tomatoes, it can be really, really hot. We've gotten into some cooler weather right now, but there are options. I think we're most familiar with number 2, the blanching method, because a lot of recipes will call for that. So when you're removing the skins from tomatoes, using the first method or the second method, you would start by cleaning the tomato and then marking with an X on the blossom end. And what that's going to allow is for those peels to easily peel off later on. So if you're doing the freezing method, you've cut that X and then you put them into the freezer. And depending on how large they are, they can take about 4 hours to really freeze. And then all you have to do is run them over room temperature or cold water, and the skins, believe it or not, will just peel right off. We end up usually doing something later on with the peels, roasting them a little bit more and eating them, but they can also just go into your compost or made when you go to make some yummy soup broth. The second method, the blanching method, is when you bring up a pot of water to boil. So imagine doing this on a hot day and then going into canning. It can get really hot in your kitchen. So after you've marked that X on the blossom end, you would put them in the water, depending on how large they are. Sometimes it takes 30 seconds, sometimes it takes a minute. You'll notice that the peels just start to peel away, and you take them off, put them to the side to cool, and do another batch of tomatoes. This will very quickly take off those skins. And the other method, which I love and my sons love the most, is the oven method. And basically you would cut your tomato just in half, whether you're using a giant heirloom or a small Roma, a paste tomato, a saucer. Just cut it in half, core it by removing some of where that the stem was, and put it cut side down. Just use a little bit of olive oil so it doesn't stick. Cut side down, and you roast it at 400 degrees for about a half hour or so. And then those peels, if you just take some nice tongs, you can just pluck them right off and you're good to go. So we just wanted to provide that bonus tip right there. And I think we have one more. Okay, so another one. When you're talking about canning, there are some food safety concerns that Nicole and I have shared with you. It can scare people a little bit. And again, that's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to connect the dots. But if you're a little bit hesitant to start canning and you'd rather do one of our workshops with us for the first time, don't think that you can't do a lot of the things that we were talking about with canning. So with the Waterbath canner, that's typically known for making a lot of those high acid products like pickles, like jams, and like jellies. We don't always grow enough in our garden or have enough at one time to do these large batches that canning recipes often called for. So when I was canning yesterday, I was canning some squash and zucchini, and the recipe called for 4 pounds. And we just harvest that we had this week, because you don't want to modify that recipes. But on weeks when we tend to have a little bit less of something, we will make what's called refrigerator pickles, and we'll have some resources emailed to you on that as well. But it's basically making pickles, but taking out that canning processing step. So you would make a brine. Typically, you would heat up some vinegar that is meant for cooking. You don't want to use cleaning vinegar. The acetic acid is a little bit different. We're looking at 5% strength. That's going to be typical on a lot of the vinegars that you see in the grocery store. And you'll bring that up to a boil, and recipes will call for sugar and salt. And you can actually play around with a little bit of the flavors as long as you're keeping the acidity intact. But instead of having to can it, you can pour that hot brine over your fresh packed vegetables. And think beyond just cucumbers. Think green beans, radishes, a smorgasbord of vegetables that you have a little bit of cauliflower or carrots. It can be a mixture of things that you can then pickle. And as long as your refrigerator is at about 40 degrees or cooler, it will take about a week or so, maybe longer, depending on what you're pickling, to really taste like it's been pickled. But as long as you're not putting in dirty hands or dirty utensils, that can stay in the back of that cool fridge for about a month. So if you're anything like the Lantermans, we eat a lot of pickled fruits and vegetables. So that a month, we'll consume that in about a week's time. So consider refrigeration pickles for putting up your harvest. Great in sandwiches, great in your grilled cheeses, even if you do plant-based cheese. We love it. So the other quick one I'll also mention is jam. A lot of folks use the Waterbath canner to make jams and jellies, but they also can be frozen. So if you don't have a ton of berries, or you supported that farmer and just have a little bit extra, consider following a recipe and just freezing it in small batches later. Those smaller canning jars work really great. With any of these things, either if you're canning or taking out of the freezer, you want to make sure that you're keeping them in the refrigerator. So we probably didn't mention that before, but I will just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So if you've taken out, I've got this jar right here that's been properly canned. This will live in my pantry where it's dark and cold. But as soon as I crack open this jar, I will then store it in the refrigerator until we're done. And that can be about up to a week, depending on what it is. Anything you want to add, Nicole, to that?
No, not that. Was what comment in the chat before you continue. There's a comment.
So I think Kate is actually going to she's going to spit us out some of the questions in the chat. Okay. So We're going to take some questions right now. These are some of the resources that we have that will automatically be emailed to you. So what Nicole and I think is a great little introductory food safety, just some general stuff and some stuff on canning, freezing, dehydrating. If we don't get to all your questions here today, Nicole and I are very reachable by email. We can set up a phone call. And if you want to stay tuned to our next hands-on canning or pressure bath canning workshop, just give us an email and we'll put you on the list. And we hope to offer some of this remotely while we're getting through these tough times. All right, Kate, we'll give that to you.
Awesome. If you could advance the slide, Sejal. So we have couple things to share. One is that we have this amazing extension program called the Master Gardener Program, and it exists at URI and in almost every state in the United States to train folks who have a passion for gardening or horticulture. And we give you science-based information, dispel myths, and then we empower you to share your knowledge with the community in a number of different ways. So the application period for the Master Gardener Program is actually open now until November 1st. We'd encourage you to consider joining our gardening family at Extension, and you'll see a lot more of all of us, which I'm sure you're very excited about. Next slide. And we have a few resources before we get to the questions that I think we can share with you. And again, I'll just mention this presentation will be posted on our URI Cooperative Extension YouTube page, which I put the link to in the chat box. We've had a chat box enabled and a Q&A. So that's, I'm going to attempt to get through all of your questions after this, but we want to draw your attention to our gardening resources on the Master Gardener Program page at that link right there on the screen. And then also we have a gardening and environmental hotline where you can actually write an email to a real live person in Rhode Island and they will answer you within 3 business days or so. Going forward into the fall, every Tuesday at 7, we'll have a webinar offered and there'll be some press going out about that. We have an incredibly robust series of webinars planned and you should all mark your calendars as busy. Tuesdays at 7 p.m. You'll see either Sejal or I or our colleague Vanessa guiding you through those. And then if you have general questions, you need some advice, or you need help locating a program or a staff person, you can always call our number 874-2900. So if you will go back 2 slides, Sejal, to your food preservation specific resources, we can leave those up for folks. And we have a wonderfully robust list of questions, which I am just gonna rattle off by topic. So the first one is that someone saw an elderly woman canning tomatoes and not water bathing the jars. They were filling the jars, putting the lids on, and then turning the jars upside down to seal them. Can you explain the pros and cons of this canning process, please?
Okay. That process is you fill jars with hot product is used in processing a lot. You know, we don't recommend it because you need to make sure that your product is getting to the hot enough temperature and that it stays at that hot enough temperature for a period of time in order to sterilize the jars. And you're going to be handling a very hot product. So use the boiling water bath canning method. It's the safest way to can that. You'd have to, because when they do that in processing, they're using equipment, they're heating the food to like 200 Fahrenheit and filling it in the jar. They need to know that that temperature is maintained for a period of time in order to sterilize the jars. So it's too complicated. I would use the boiling water bath method.
Great. And next question, using wax for canning.
Yep, that's another great question that used to be used more commonly, especially with jams and jellies. And it's just not recommended that you use that method anymore because you want to use the boiling water bath method, process it that way, and you don't need to put wax on. the wax used to be used to, was it used in place of lids? I don't remember.
Yeah,
It's not
I
recommended.
think so. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And I think that's also important if you have even really older books from Cooperative Extension, or even old, canning books and things like that. You really want to make sure that some of them are up to date. Even as of like the last couple of years, they've realized that there's no safe water bath canning recipes for squash and zucchini. So you heard me talking a lot about how I pickle them, and that's because we've added that acidity. So you want to make sure you're using up-to-date resources as well. What's next, Kate?
Oh, we've got a lot. Someone lovingly mentioned that the University of Maine Cooperative Extension offers preserving webinars every Tuesday at 2. So you all might.
Oh, wow.
Yep, you might. I'm just going to mute you guys. You might want to flag that as an option for getting some more information. Again, Tuesdays at 2, you can look up University of Maine Cooperative Extension. There's another question here. I have been advised I can use parchment paper as a barrier between the substance in the jar, like vinegar, and the lid. Thoughts on that?
No need to. You don't need to use parchment paper to separate the jar from the food. Are you talking about after? Maybe, I don't know if they're talking about before or after they're opening.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that's with canning or if perhaps with fermenting, Nicole. But I'm not familiar with that practice with canning at all.
Okay. How about do all dehydrators add some level of heat and air circulation? What's the temp?
Yeah, so with the dehydrator, the ones that I showed on that screen, there's usually electricity. I don't know of any other kind, but you plug them in, and the temperature range is about 90 degrees to, I'm trying to think, you think of the hottest item on that one. I know you've done some of the jerkies and stuff, but I'm guessing it's probably, I'd have to.
I can't remember. I want to say
guess.
like 145, but I can't remember.
Yeah, that's about what I was going to go for too. I was going to say a little bit under 150. Yep, but those are forced air using electricity, and you can get additional racks for those dehydrators, so you can make them go taller and taller. And there are ones that are very, very large, that even commercial or smaller farms will use as well. So there's a wide range of sizes and options there.
Great. Let's see. So desiccant packs in dried food, when things are already dried for storage, should those be added, or does it make things worse? A couple questions about that.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm going to look into that. I think as long as it's rated for food, it's safe. I mean, when you buy food at the grocery store, sometimes they have a desiccant package, and if it's something you're able to purchase that's made to be next to food, then that's another way you can keep moisture. But I'm not sure if that's commercially available to us. But that would work if it's food grade.
Great. Someone asked if you're going to mention tinctures. They made a ginger tincture, and I noticed you didn't mention them, and so maybe you guys do or don't have resources for making tinctures.
Sage, can you take that?
No, I have. I've made some extracts before, and I'm thinking that that's probably in line with what we're talking about. We would be happy to try to look into that a little bit more, just to get some, just some food safety aspects of that to back it up. But no, that is not something that Nicole and I co-teach, but that's an interesting one.
Great. Some specific questions about vinegars. So made a cider vinegar with thyme in it. It's in the refrigerator. Thoughts on longevity?
I don't know. I think it will be good for a while. I mean, it's not going to spoil. It's not, vinegar is one of those foods that you don't, like, and for processors, it's like, unless you're making vinegar, then you have to comply with like food safety rules, but vinegar is so acidic that nothing likes it. So I think that would be shelf stable or, you know, held in the refrigerator for a while.
Great. How about, is it okay to use 6% acid vinegar? There's a lot of questions about using 6% acid vinegar. Can you sub apple cider vinegar or other 5% vinegars for white vinegar? We talk a little bit more about vinegars.
Okay. I think, you know, the biggest thing with vinegars is to make sure you're purchasing commercially available vinegar, because the acidity is not going to fluctuate and it's going to have that consistent acidity that you need for safety. So that when you're measuring out the vinegar, following the recipe, you know that whatever volume it's telling you to put in, you're going to have the right acidity, versus a homemade vinegar, which, you know, maybe the acidity will fluctuate more and you might not have that consistent acidity. So we recommend using commercially available vinegars, and they should be interchangeable.
Yeah, especially for making refrigerator pickles. For some folks, it does take a little bit of getting used to with the apple cider vinegar. It's like just a little bit more robust. I personally love it. But especially with the refrigerator ones, as long as you were using, like Nicole said, that commercially available vinegar, you could flip flop the apple cider vinegar for the white vinegar. But I'm not so positive on canning recipes, Nicole. Without thinking about it, I would think if the percentage was the same, then I don't know how that would make a difference. But your thoughts on that, or you think maybe we could do follow up and we could look that one up if we're not so positive?
Yeah, let's look that up, because I think that all the commercially available vinegars are interchangeable, but you know, it's better to look it up than to just assume.
David's asking, does cleaning vinegar differ in any other aspects than acidity? Lots of great vinegar questions, folks.
Yeah, that I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe we can follow up on the vinegar questions. I'm impressed with these questions. We do have a couple more. So is it, just to pivot a little bit, is it safe to store tomatoes from my garden in plastic bags in the freezer rather than going through all the trouble of canning them?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want to definitely think about the plastic bags. You know, you want those plastic bags to be clean. You don't want to reuse them from the thawed fish or the thawed meat that you used. So just connecting the dots on some of those issues. But you can absolutely, that's something, you know, if you have a deep freezer or an extra freezer and you have the room, and, you know, for those of you growing tomatoes, some of us might be growing the indeterminate variety where they're going to be spitting tomatoes throughout the season versus the bush or the determinate varieties, which usually gives you all of your tomatoes at one time. So sometimes we don't always have enough tomatoes on hand. So you can freeze them in the short term to then heat up and can later, as long as you are, you know, just following those approved recipes if you go to can them. If you go to make freezer sauce, you know, if you want to take it one step further, you've got your tomatoes. You can explore with all of these different flavors when you're freezing, but it's just when you have to follow those approved recipes to make a shelf-stable product that you want to use those approved recipes that are looking at all the things that Nicole talked about.
Great. Yeah, that's good. Let's see. This is a good one. I'm using a ball recipe book, and many pickling recipes are too salty or use too much sugar. Do either of you have suggestions for lower salt or sugar recipes?
The only suggestion I can have is pivot from the ball book and look into some larger ones. Like Nicole had mentioned, the complete ball book or the Georgia one. There are some low sugar, low salt recipes that are available. But again, you just want to make sure if you're doing it for canning, then you're using that approved recipe. Even for jams, Nicole and I think one of our most popular classes is the low sugar jam recipe that we teach and cook. So those recipes are out there. Just again, if you're canning or pressure canning, you just want to make sure you're using an approved recipe and just be on the lookout for those ones that have been modified to allow for that. Maybe that lower salt might be a little tricky depending on what you're doing, but the low sugar ones definitely exist.
Couple more questions. We're gonna have stop at some point or we'll all be here all day. These are great, folks, and thanks for listening so intently. So this is an interesting question. Is there a place one can send old family pickling recipes or ones from old cookbooks so they can be tested and certified?
Yeah, that is a great question. And process authorities are responsible for that, but we don't have a process authority here. We have the University of Maine has a process authority, and Cornell has a process authority. You will pay for them to do this, but typically processors or food entrepreneurs, if they want to make a canned product, they have to get the scheduled process from the process authority. So they send their recipe, their process, and it's tested. So yes. But the process authorities get backed up. I mean, processors have a hard time accessing them to get everything. There's a high need and there's not enough of them. So it's not something that may be easy to have done, but I just wanted to let you know.
Awesome. Maybe we'll end on a gel question. What is clear gel and is it necessary?
Yeah, so clear gel is like a name brand basically for pectin, and you're going to find pectin when you adventure into a lot of your jams and jellies. And pectin is a naturally found compound high in apples, and it really allows those products to set, if you will, so that you have a jam that's properly turns into gel. I don't know how else to describe that. We always do like to give a tip. We always want people to buy in bulk, but one of the things you want to think about is not buying pectin in bulk because it does lose its potency over time. So start out with a new fresh pectin. When you go to make your jams and jellies, come under all different name brands. Some are liquid, some are powder. They're not interchangeable, so follow the recipe for what they're calling. When you buy the pectin, there's usually recipes on there that have been approved. And if you're interested in a low sugar jam or jelly, you would want to find a pectin that's special formulated to allow for the low sugar, no sugar option. There are sometimes when you can substitute honey and other sugar substitutes. So that's always a great way to branch out from just using sugar. So yeah, pectin, I think I could speak a whole hour on pectin. And then the only other thing I'll mention is if you accidentally use pectin that lost its potency, you would just want to take what you were trying to make, which would have been a jam, cross that out and just call it a syrup and you're good. There's not a food safety concern. You're just not going to have that nice set of a jam or a jelly. You'll just be making a syrup instead.
More questions. Which ball book do you recommend?
I think any of the ball books, the one that Nicole and I were talking about, it's very it's not very long. It's called the Blue Book, The Guide to Preserving. So if you're interested in trying to just do a little bit of all the things that we discussed, this is like a really great go-to. But if you want to step it up a notch, there's also the complete ball book, and that's going to be a lot larger. It's going to have a lot more recipes. Honestly, I would definitely check out their website and all these other approved websites because you can get so many of these for free online. A lot of them you can even type in what it is that you're trying to preserve. So let's say it's tomatoes. How do you want to preserve it? Do you want to freeze? Do you want to can it? Do you want to, dehydrate it? And it will kind of take you through the motions and then spit out a bunch of recipes at you. We just don't want you going on to, blogs of people that are lawyers by day and canners by night and just coming up with these things. You just, again, want to go to those approved sites. But so many different books and cooperative extension agencies throughout the entire country that offer free recipes. And your library, just make sure you're looking for approved. I guess I've said that word a million times today, but it's important.
Yeah, I think the books need to be like from the late 90s or the early 2000s. I can't remember which year, but changes were made around that time frame. So you don't want to use a ball book predated. So the older ball books, there may be changes. So the newest or the newer ones that you can access are better for safety.
That's helpful. It's crazy how things change, but that's the beauty of science. We keep learning more. So, Marianne, thank you very much for putting up the food preservation webinar series from the University of Maine. It sounds like our sister institution has a lot of preservation resources in addition to those that Sejal and Nicole have provided. If you're here live, you'll get some resources emailed to you. And for those who are asking about staying connected to Nicole and Sejal for in-person or virtual food preservation classes, I would recommend going to the Cooperative Extension website and clicking on Contact Us, and you can find their contact information there. And one more time, I'll just remind you all that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the URI Cooperative Extension YouTube channel. So thank you all for participating. We had a really great group and a great discussion. Thank you, Nicole and Sejal. You guys are fantastic. And I love you very much. And everyone enjoy this beautiful day.
Great. Thanks, Kate. It was so much fun. Can't wait to do it in person. Have a great one.
Yes. Thank
I
you.
just saw one last thing. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can get all of these links in the description as well. We're going to put them everywhere and they'll be automatically emailed. Thanks so much. Enjoy the day, everybody, and happy preserving.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.